Response video to Fred. Mystic sort of predicted a wank fest, as he called it, and it just seems kind of funny that there's masturbate and wanky and all kinds of references, of a woo-woo wank fest. On the subject of free will, like the subject is going to get derailed by this subjectivist. Let's talk about what it feels like rather than what we think it's made out of, what it's actually happening. And we even have this little line here by Conference Report. E prime is really interesting and definitely related. Well, E prime, as I understand it, is all about ignoring context, facts, reality, and converting everything into some kind of idiotic, how does it make me feel kind of language, instead of talking about an absolute or just a functional, pragmatic truth of your reality. Just internalize everything and talk about what it just makes you feel, because that's all we can know is our feelings. And that's, to me, going backwards. Because the argument being made here is that our perceptions, what we feel, is entirely illusion. It's a function of the brain to create those illusions, because those are used to motivate us, to move us. And that obviously is a word kind of related to will, because will is what we sense we have before action is initiated. Or, as some science indicates, the action is initiated through the mechanical process, and we get this sensation after it's already decided what your will is going to be. So here's an example. So I was working on this last night. This is the new the front page for my website. I might as well play a little bit of this just because it's kind of a nice little tune. The Thunderdome song. Anyway, so I was just noticing, because I was playing that, I was looking at it. And so you have one of these optical illusions that happens here, is if you're late enough and you're tired enough, you will see these letters move, okay, because of their cloud background. And you can logically know there's no way that can be happening. There's no way like the pixels of the clouds behind there are moving around these letters and being bent or something, and my eye is getting a distortion. No, it's completely a contrivance in my brain. My brain has misinterpreted reality. It's augmented it. It's fluffed it. And because of just some error code, some imperfection in the way it processes. And some of that might be because it was advantageous to our survival for us to exaggerate elements of the environment, to get hysterically afraid, to do something. Sometimes the mechanics is exaggerated or distorted because it would have a functional purpose in us being deluded or fooled or misinterpreting reality. So that's why feelings are just nothing. They're no way to judge anything. They're a fact. Let's acknowledge them as a fact, that they exist. But let's explain them practically and logically as if we understand what's happening through the communication. It's like understanding how a story gets distorted as it passes from a person to another person to another person to another person. So you go through 10 people telling a story, and the story can kind of dramatically change because each person flaws it and breaks it and distorts it based on their reflex. And so again, I'm going to come back to reflex. All right, and Fred also threw in this line, he did it in another video, and you're just like, well, what am I supposed to do with that? He said 11 dimensions. What? What do I do with that crap? Your physical fact, the fact of physics. And then he also referenced again how, because a couple of physicists weren't articulate enough to explain quantum mechanics and said stupid, dopey things like, well, if you think you understand it, you don't understand it, or some other little catchphrase, almost like the Einstein rolling dice thing. They use metaphors or some way to just escape or evade being explicit, because being explicit would be kind of complicated and dull and boring. So they use some little catchphrase, and yes, so now the catchphrase is the reality. No, it's not the reality. Quantum mechanics can be understood as what it is: error math, probability math. Okay, you take a variable and you refine it into a cloud of possibility, because you can't define it explicitly. You can't say it's a 3, a 4, or a 5. But what you can say is it's a 3, a 4, or a 5. And so we now have math that will allow you to have a fudge variable somewhere in the range of. And that's quantum mechanics in the very briefest sense, okay? But it's a contrivance and mechanism that you use so you can go as far as you can take our knowledge. So you can do, the experiment doesn't have to be perfect. It can be imperfect, and you can still glean information from it, just as you can have a survey of human conduct or behavior. And you can have lots of flaws in your sample, but you can still glean useful information for it, because you can understand what your error rate is and understand that if it's way beyond that error rate, the results, that you still glean something useful. And the same kind of theory would be behind quantum mechanics. So it's, again, Fred's always trying, and he is trying to do this part, so I agree with the mystic in that sense. He's just trying to take everything that we can make more concrete and just keep it over there in the fog. Because if you make it concrete, it doesn't say anything glamorous about existence. It says exactly the opposite about existence, that we are, in fact, drones to this whirlwind. We were not moving anything. He even did that in his comment to Laura Layla, where she's talking about unsettled, and he made the comment like where we would blame the trees are moving the air, because the wind blows the trees. We would assume the trees are moving the air, and so again he calls this purple prose, but that there's just, and I'm not saying it's against the law. I'm saying that when it's all over the place, I can do a statistical survey and say, well, it's beyond the law, it's beyond the realm of what we would expect as a random result, so to speak, a probabilistic likely outcome, without some sort of deliberate effort to make it purple. It's not a reflection of natural purplosity. It's willful purpleization. It's taking that story from person 1 to person 3, and there not being too much accuracy in terms of what was retained of the reality that was given and the interpretation that was produced. And that's what's to understand. I think this is my theory. All right, it's not 11 dimensions that runs the universe. Or our perception. What runs our perception is the fact that it's a bunch of reflexes, a knot of reflexes, and they're knotted into categorical levels of reaction, let's call it. And so we could say that the two main nodes are the action brain and the reaction brain. The action brain creates the feeling. The action brain reacts to the feeling, and in turn creates the feeling, and then it reacts to its own created feeling. So it's this gap between action and reaction that it creates, a synapse of its own between these two nodes of self. And then you can break each one of those nodes down into separate kinds of categories, like a feeling that represents, or what we have labeled, guilt, or a feeling that we've labeled elation, or power, or you could take these nodes, and they're all functioning as individual nodes of reflexive behavior. So I could say I could take a tiny influence, a little photon, or just one of these little tiny screws, and I could throw it at a reflexor. Okay, nothing would happen because it's too small to create a reaction. But if the mechanism was built so that it added up these little impacts, each little impact got added and added and added, and when there's enough little impacts, it responded by throwing one back. Right? So that's what's happening. There's just action through the energy moves into us, and it stores up in cycles and eddies and knots of complexity, of roadways that nowhere, that just spin around and swirl and do all kinds of crap. So a photon can fly into my eye 10 years ago, and its reflex, its pattern, its pathway could be still running through my brain. This is metaphorical because there is all this automatic reflex right at the surface of our eye that already destroys the photon. But the idea of its influence, its vibration, can move through me for 10 years. For 10 years, the impact of that photon could move through my brain, through my neurology, and finally be the impact that boom, that reacted, and the screen cracked. I finally hit it enough times, it cracked. The manifestation of crack is a new action now, and that action will be reflexively reacted to. So here at the level of our consciousness, we're at the top, let's say, the final vibration. So all those little vibrations keep coming in our life experience. Through our whole life experience, zillions of little vibrations come into us, and they are nuanced through this mechanics into this thing we call a consciousness, into an action in the end. Ultimately, that's what it produces. And so it's 4 billion years of evolution. I mean, billions of years. I mean, this is a long time. Well, let's even just talk about 1 million years. A really long time to refine how a machine is going to work, and especially when it's existing in a competitive environment, and especially when most of the life forms that were doing the evolving, had a life cycle of 2 years or less. So lots of change possible. Another example of how this whole thing is just so non-real to the real world is the things, most of this stuff evolving out there lives a matter of minutes or days. And so it goes through tremendous numbers of experiments. And yet through all that potential for change and nuance and creating this advantage psychology mechanism thing, it never did it. It never created it because it just isn't necessary to the functionality. All right, so again, so here we are with this one organism on the planet that has done this highest level of modeling. Now, there's lots of other mammals out there and animals that are doing plenty of the feeling stuff. They definitely have the two brains functioning, the two nodes, the one reacting with this thing we feel. And let's understand a feeling is like a kind of a vibration, and that may be, and so it's the vibrations getting transferred like the rumble of an engine. But the rumble is something that's the machine is just vibrating. The making of the sound isn't necessarily the function of what's happening. The vibration can be communicated to a sensor that understands a little switch going in and out every time it vibrates, and it wouldn't care about the noise that's produced. That's a symptom of the functionality. The symptom of the functionality of what our brain does is this component that we might call feeling or consciousness. But the mechanics are riding behind it, so it's just creating a sonic boom as a consequence of what it's doing, kind of a scenario. And that's always going to be a difficult one to explain, like affinity or something. I mean, these are hard things to put into a model. It's hard to write the mathematical equation for things like those. The fact of what it actually is, how you can't just put a conscious thing in your hand and say there's consciousness. But we understand where it came from, we understand the mechanism, and we can understand the evidence exists for us to understand that what's taking place is just eccentricity. It's just elaborateness for the sake of elaborateness to some extent. It's reflexes piled on top of reflexes, piled on top of reflexes, piled on top of reflexes that were constructed for the purpose of a survival mechanism. And so again, it goes back to what is our brain's function. All right? Its function is to create motivation, a moving force. So that's why we feel, is so the other brain could say, okay, I need. And now that I have an agenda, I will now act, because it's been imposed upon me, this thing called agenda. There's cause for me to do this, and that's part of the mechanism that's just obvious to the functionality, is to create the motivation, and then it's processed through this mechanics that's just obviously attempting to model what's in the world, so it can function it, so it can know these things and know relationships. So again, you talked about knowing something as if it's out of our touch. We can't know what it is to be the bottle or be the liquid. Well, of course we can't, because it's too simple to be to be known. It can't do what we're doing. It's not a knowable. In any kind of real sense, in the sense of you can't know it as a feeling, because it isn't. The only thing it feels is models. Models create feelings. Constructs. It's an artificial thing that's feeling. It's an artificial organ. It's not a real thing that's feeling. It's an arrangement. It's nodes, it's mass of movement and of electricity that's creating the illusion of the sensation of feeling it, the connection. And what is that connection made out of? It's made out of an understanding of association, relationship. Okay, blue gets associated with a certain kind of thing, red with another kind of thing. It's a relationship. The feel of water, the feel of sticky, even the feels. All these things are just what we're able to do in terms of understanding something's reality. There's something about components of its reality, and we sense those components through these tactile these interactions, and understand them for their association, what they have in common with each other, that round and round and wet and wet, and I mean we're just acknowledging the relationships that exist. That not only exist in the fact that, I mean, this bottle has a relationship to a bottle in China. The brothers it was manufactured with, the shape, the plastic, the chemistry of the plastic. These are all categories of common functionality or purpose. And so even though the relationship there's very little direct relationship left, and the only relationship is so ancient and it's just in its structure itself, just in its shape. It now has it has now connected itself in almost some sort of genetic way to something that it's not really connected to. I mean, all animals with vision fall into a category, but they all didn't get their vision the same way. Their vision doesn't have the same origin, doesn't have the same branch. There's no common branch to where they both had they both had a common vision. They both grew that after they left each other. They went into separate categories and created them and put themselves back in a similar category but they're completely disconnected from each other. Well, anyway, so I don't want to get lost in too much of this stuff, but I think it is a practically useful metaphor. Strings are a useful metaphor in terms of understanding that the energy, if we just think of the energy as strings, the energy comes into us. We process it. We pull and tug, and the strings pull and tug on us. We think we're pulling and tugging, but there's no we. There's just strings of complexity. They're knots of, where everything's just tangled all up. And we can understand them as just that. They're just knots. They're just places where it's looped around another thing, and you can unloop it, and we can understand the mechanics of it. I'm not saying we literally can, like we can detail it with our knowledge now, but we understand the general principle, and the general principle is that you're not doing anything that wasn't dictated, okay, by millions of years of evolution and your environmental maturation and what you're exposed to through your life experience. And that's the same for everybody else in this knotty mess. The knots were inevitable. As soon as you took the two strings and you or 5 or 10 strings and you pushed them all into the same direction, you moved them all in the same way, they were going to impact each other and they were going to tangle. And this entanglement has created this thing that's really bizarre. Yes, we feel, but it can be understood for what it is. And it can be understood for why it behaves the way it does, why this illusion of wave can be understood. And we have to understand it for what it's really doing if we're going to be thinkers, and not what we feel about it. What we feel or what we sense, that is relevant as a description of how we reflexive react, but it's not relevant in terms of the judgment. The judgment and the real mechanics has to be understood through modeling that has to be disconnected from purple, the sensation of purple. It just, if you're gonna, you can't turn into wankery. You can't wank over it. You've got to accept that we're attempting to describe the process, not the reaction. We're interrupting to understand. You really do have to interrupt the cycle of action and reaction, and you have to just break a piece off of it and look at it separate and understand how it is being played with, what strings are being pulled. You can't just say, I see string moving before my eyes. That's not really going to be understanding. So anyway, but yeah, there seems to be a real tendency to want to feel life and call that a philosophy. So again, this is this troublesome line that I've been fighting with ever since I've been on YouTube between philosophy, which is attempting to describe the reality of the circumstance, and psychology, which is attempting to live the reality and even live with the knowledge. So I mean, it's like you change the knowledge a little, you put it into some sort of more palatable, edible form, kind of like breaking quantum mechanics down, or Einstein's don't play dice with God doesn't play dice with the universe, or some simplification, some cupcake, and and some of that is necessary, I might concede, but there's too much cupcake. There's way too much psychology in our philosophy, and both in motivation and in I mean, you can see it in the science, where these scientists are obviously ego-driven, and they're obviously trying to create results. They're trying to create validation of their hopes and wishes, rather than get explicit about what it really means. Yeah, so again, yeah, it is troublesome to attempt to get more explicit and get the model clearer in terms of the, get the fog, as much of the smearing that's taking place with our psychology, the blurring because of our sloppiness. And, it's very frustrating that, one, we're trying to clean it up, and the other side keeps finger painting on it because it's pretty colors. They keep trying to make it look pretty. And the other side just keeps trying to make it clearer. Yeah. So anyway. Yeah, I guess there's nothing else to say. Just stop peanut buttering on my chocolate. There's no real point in having a conversation if we're not going to share language. So if you're going to start, whatever that is, if you're going to start using language that's connected to your experiential and phenomenology, well, yeah, it was just, let's concede we can't have conversation until we go a step lower and start talking about, what's the real mechanics. That's not what you're talking about, I don't think. Anyway, enough. In touch.